One of the Pope's close collaborators is sharing his thoughts on Francis's pontificate, while controversy swirls over a Vatican deal with China and a sex abuse scandal in Chile. The papal posse, Robert Royal and Father GERALD Murray, will react. And another mass shooting, this time a high school in Florida. What are the common characteristics of these mass shooters, and how do we prevent the next one? Father Charles SIKORSKY of the Institute for the Psychological Sciences will tell us. And finally, ABC News correspondent LINSEY DAVIS tells us what inspired her to write children's books. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. Robert Royal, Father GERALD Murray, Father Charles SIKORSKY, and LINSEY DAVIS in a story-oriented segment are all straight ahead. We'll also be joined by SUZANNE HOLLMAN, a psychologist. She'll talk about that terrible shooting in Florida. If you'd like to comment on tonight's program, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email me at worldover@ewtn.com. But I have to be honest, I rarely read those emails. So tweet away. Let's get right to it. The Vatican is confirming that Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI's health has declined, but they claim he is not suffering from any immediate health risks. Italian journalist Massimo Franco and former Vatican spokesman Federico Lombardi said on Thursday that Benedict was frail but alert. Questions over the health of the 90-year-old Pope were raised when his brother, Father Georg Ratzinger, told a German magazine that Benedict has a degenerative disease that could lead to total paralysis and affect his heart. The Holy See press office denied that the Pope Emeritus is suffering from the disease. This past week marked the 5th anniversary of Benedict's historic renunciation of the papacy. He wrote a brief letter to readers of an Italian daily who were concerned about him. He said that he is slowing, his strength is declining, but that internally he's on a pilgrimage home. Benedict thanked the readers and said, "It is a grace to be surrounded by such love on this, quote, sometimes difficult final stretch of the road." Our prayers are with the Pope Emeritus. Also on Thursday, the Vatican revealed that Pope Francis meets with victims of sexual abuse regularly. The comment comes on the heels of what has become a public relations nightmare after Francis was dismissive of reported clerical abuse and a cover-up in Chile. Seeking to defuse a mounting scandal, spokesman Greg Burke said the Pope meets privately with victims, usually on Fridays, several times a month. Burke said Pope Francis is there to listen to them and try to help them to heal their serious wounds. Burke's statement coincided with the release of a transcript of a recent meeting Francis held with Jesuits in Chile and Peru. He told them that the percentage of abusive pedophile priests was not a lot, but that it's terrible if it were just one of our brothers. Juan Carlos Cruz, one of the alleged Chilean victims who appeared on The World Over last week, responded to the Vatican comments, saying that if Francis truly listened to victims, he would have learned how much they suffer, particularly when they're mistreated by their own pastors. We shouldn't have to wait, he said, until the media are banging on the door to do something. And Christians in China are feeling the tightening noose of the communist regime's new regulations on religion. According to reports, minors have been banned from entering places of worship in several regions in China, while Protestant house churches in the Henan province have been forced to close. Meanwhile, government officials are cracking down on underground Catholics, those loyal to Rome, forbidding them and their communities to celebrate Mass. One Shanghai priest has told his parishioners not to come to Sunday Mass because there won't be one due to new enforcement measures. According to the regulations, authorities have been directed to crack down on, quote, illegal religious activities and foreign infiltration. They are to prevent religious organizations from interfering with local public affairs and to stop the construction of churches and religious statues without prior approval. The new regulations went into effect on February 1st. And as an accord between the Vatican and Communist China on the appointment of bishops nears, the former Bishop of Hong Kong continues to speak out against the deal. Cardinal Joseph Zen says that the plan to recognize 7 bishops approved by Beijing is a betrayal of the underground church in China. Vatican and Chinese officials who support the agreement say it's a way to heal the 70-year-old rift between the Holy See and Beijing, and a way to bring the communist state-run church and the underground church together in unity. According to the proposed terms, Pope Francis's recognition of the Beijing-approved bishops, all of whom were excommunicated, would in turn give Rome the right to veto future appointments by Beijing. According to reports, some of these Beijing bishops have familial relationships, that is to say, girlfriends and children. Cardinal Zen remains adamant in his opposition, saying that the Vatican is, quote, putting wolves before your flock, and they are going to make a massacre. Zen says that the loyal faithful in China are being asked to surrender to the communist regime. Here with analysis is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, with me in studio, and from Manhattan, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. I want to begin with Father Antonio Spadaro. He's the Jesuit editor-in-chief of La Civiltà Cattolica, a very influential Jesuit journal in Rome, and he's known to be a close associate of Pope Francis. He's taken it upon himself to clarify and speak for the Pope all over the world. Well, he was here in D.C. this week, speaking at Georgetown. We asked Father Spadaro for a sit-down interview. He did not have time for the interview, he told us. Nonetheless, we sent a camera to his talk entitled Pope Francis's Global Vision and His Work for a More Just and Peaceful World. Pithy. Here is Father Spadaro talking about the Pope's approach to diplomacy. Listen.
The Pope is light years away from the theorist of a clash of civilizations. Francis seeks to dissolve the narrative of a toxic final clash of religions that nourishes the fear of chaos.
Father Jerry Murray, your reaction to what you heard Father Spadaro say there?
Well, that's very puzzling what he's saying, because it's reducing human life to simply a game of king of the hill. And the Church teaches the exact opposite. Human life is about fulfilling God's will, knowing that will, and then trying to bring a society into accord with that will. And that involves identifying things that are evil, reprobating them. You have to identify what is just and good, writing good laws to promote them. So, for instance, when the Church was fighting against the Roman Empire to survive, we didn't say, well, the Roman Empire is acting in a just way by throwing Christians to the lions. It's just a question of who's going to be in charge here. The fight against communism, which has produced so many martyrs in the 20th and even the 21st century, that is a fight of good and evil. President Reagan was right. It's identifying who your enemy is, which allows you to then speak clearly the truth. Pretending there are no differences is very naive. I think Father Spadaro's words have to be reconsidered, because they really don't express the truth.
Robert Royal, your thoughts on how what we hear here is the Pope's approach to diplomacy, mainly the notion that the Pope is not here to say who is right or who is wrong, and that it's wrong to take sides for moral reasons. Do you see a connection between this and the thought laid out in Amoris Laetitia or some of his other writings?
Well, I would agree with Father Murray that, first of all, this is a very puzzling statement and confusing, as so many other things that we hear about from this Vatican are. To begin with, going all the way back to ancient Greece, there's been a debate about the sophists who think that everything is a matter of power, and those who think that truth, goodness, fair dealing is what guides human activity. To abolish this sort of in diplomacy for the sake of a conversation, sure, you could do such a thing. But
Not
the
in
Pope,
reality.
But in reality, the Pope certainly has views about the environment, about the international economic situation that he's stated very forcefully and made judgments about. And I think he ought to, if that's what he believes. Now, when you actually sit down with people, of course, that's a different story. You each try to get what you can in a diplomatic situation. But to lay that out as we don't mix religion, moral questions of right and wrong, this seems to me to abandon what the primary role of the church in the world is. And so, I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's a big question to say, from there, do we look at Amoris Laetitia and we get the same sort of thing? But there does seem to be, in that idea of accompaniment and discernment, a suspension of what we really believe, and in the meantime, we wander about in a conversation. So in some ways, if this is indeed the Pope's thinking, and we have to recognize that Father Spadaro may have a different understanding of this than Francis himself has. Yes, there seems to be a kind of a convergence, if not an actual identity of these two.
I want to pull this out a little more, because Father Spadaro also published in his Jesuit periodical just this week the Pope's address to Jesuits in Chile. And as part of that conversation, he talks about Amoris Laetitia. We'll put it up on the screen. He says, I believe that one of the things that the Church needs most today, and this thing is very clear in the perspectives and pastoral objectives of Amoris Laetitia, is discernment. We are used to a we can or cannot mentality. Father Jerry Murray, your reaction to that?
Well, what are we discerning? We're discerning what we should and shouldn't do. What we can't or can't do is just another way of saying what we should or should not do. Discernment is not a substitution for moral judgment. It's putting moral judgment into effect. And in the life of the Church, we have revelation, the natural law, and the Church has taught through her magisterium those things that we should do, and therefore those things that we should not or cannot do if we want to remain faithful to Christ. Discernment is not an abolisher of the categories of the moral law. Discernment is a way to apply the moral law to specific circumstances. But you only apply a law if, number one, you believe it's true, that it's valuable and good for the people to obey the law. And then you figure out, well, what are they doing that varies from the way the law is carried out? Discernment doesn't mean that, well, what we formerly said was wrong is now can be right because people look at things differently. That's not what discernment means.
I want to move on to this China controversy, because everything Father Spadaro was speaking about really pointed to that, which is a simmering crisis. We've been reporting on this. In fact, we were some of the first people to report on this. We've been doing it for years. Cardinal Zen warning about a deal between China and the Vatican that would undermine the Vatican's authority, even appointing its own bishops. Here's what Father Spadaro said about this situation. Watch.
Francis is walking the same path of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, trying to find a way to dialogue effectively with the Chinese authorities. The Church doesn't want to give away the authority to ordain bishops. The history of the Church is the history of finding agreements with the political authorities about the appointments of bishops.
Robert Royal. I read a piece by Father Drew Christensen this week, also a Jesuit, who claims the Church has been doing this for years, cooperating with China. John Paul did it, Benedict did it, in the appointment of bishops. Is that wholly true?
It's partly true. What we know from the passages that have been cited by Rome at this particular moment, from JP2 and from Benedict, is that they said, yes, we cannot persist forever in a position of opposition to a government. However, we must also be sure to safeguard. They go on in both places. There's a balance between recognizing a reality and also affirming that the Church must remain independent. And just on the historical point, I would not say that this is like what happened in the past. There's a difference when the King of France, who is a Christian and presumably a Catholic, wants to have a say in the appointment of bishops in his realm. I don't think it's a good thing historically, and it's been good actually that in modern times nations no longer have a say. But whether it's the King of France or the Holy Roman Emperor, they are part of the Christian household. When we're dealing with communist China, and I'm sorry to say, Father Christensen, who's a friend to a certain degree, I think papers over the fact that this is a communist government. He keeps on saying that this is not the old Cold War with the Soviet Union. Everyone knows that. But the DNA of communism is there in China. We've got the work camps. We've got the oppression of religion. We've got forced abortions. We've got population control. There are no human rights being respected. We have environmental disasters, which in spite of some persons in the Vatican, cannot be ignored simply because China has decided to remain in the Paris Accords on climate. So we're dealing with a regime that is not simply any regime with whom you negotiate how bishops are going to be appointed. This is a regime that in its very constitution, in its ideology, and the way it acts, seeks to eliminate, and I don't mean that lightly, to eliminate the existence of an independent church.
Yeah, no, there's no taking that away, and I don't know how people can't quite see that. I understand they're wanting to make a deal, but does that deal serve the faithful, martyred church in China that has been laboring?
And the irony is that the people who are suffering are the ones who are saying, no, don't make this deal.
And Cardinal Zen, Father Jerry Murray, as you know, he went to the Pope. He presented a letter by one of those bishops who have been under house arrest, arrested. I mean, the man has been tortured for his faith, warning about a deal with China. Where do we stand on this? And is there a dialogue? Do you see the dialogue that the Pope has promised and asked for with Cardinal Zen, members of the underground church?
Well, I completely support Cardinal Zen and those who are with him trying to make the Holy See aware that this is a disastrous decision to cede the power to the Communist Party of China to name Catholic bishops. It really is a mistake. And, you know, what we're dealing with here is a misunderstanding of how the Catholic Church should be organized. The Catholic Church is not ever a department of a government. When it becomes that, it ceases to be Catholic. That's what happened in England with the Henry VIII. I think the Holy Father, in his laudable desire to bring peace in China, is taking a wrong turn. And it's good that the rebellion, let's say, I mean, you can call it that, they're rebelling against this potential deal, that this is being made known, because the Pope has to understand, dealing with Chinese communists as if they are good faith partners to arrive at a deal that's going to promote Catholicism, that's an error. That's a mistake. They want power. They're trying to suppress religion in China as best they can. And, you know, I would say when the Pope has said before he doesn't want a top-down church, he wants a church of dialogue, he wants local bishops to be empowered to speak freely. Well, you know, I don't see a lot of dialogue going on here between the Secretary of State and the Chinese bishops about what they want. This seems to be a Vatican deal, and I think Cardinal Zen is the one we should listen to.
What do you make, Bob Royal, of Archbishop Sorondo making a goodwill tour of China, returning and saying, nowhere is the Church's social gospel lived out the way it's lived out and implemented in China?
Yeah, I guess out of respect for a fellow Christian, the less said about that remark, the better. And I don't think it will be repeated, even though we haven't seen a rebuke from the Vatican, which perhaps ought to have been forthcoming. You know, Father Raymond de Souza, who's a quite brilliant priest who lives up in Canada, he's a university chaplain and whatnot, has written a beautiful piece about the softness of this Vatican towards left-wing totalitarianism, whether it's in China, whether it's in Venezuela. The Holy Father, and I believe that Father Spadaro have talked about Northern and Southern Korea coalescing as a nation under one language and a common culture. There seems to be an outreach to the rogue regimes and a certain indulgence. I don't want to overstate this, but there is a kind of indulgence of regimes that we know are problematic, and yet a harshness toward the United States, toward Western Europe, countries like Poland and Hungary that may resist large immigration inflows. There's a bias there that I think is quite evident to people who follow the Holy See's current foreign policy. And it's one thing to have a desire to reach out, as you rightly say, but we must be realistic. We must be tellers of the truth. If you don't want to push you're right and he's wrong right away, okay, but we still must tell the truth. China is not a place where solidarity is being practiced, where capitalism is not running the political system, where the environment, as we know, which is horrible in China.
Completely polluted. And the people are all on drugs. And he said, oh, no youth are on drugs. And you didn't see them. That doesn't mean they're not on drugs.
Well,
they have an opioid explosion.
This is quite typical of all communist regimes because they don't get any input from their people. There's no response. Here in the United States, if there's a release of chemicals into a river, somebody notices and you complain and the government responds. There, the so-called solidarity and the commonality of life together is whatever the Chinese Communist Party defines it as. And so we must confront the fact that, yeah, we're not with the Soviet Union, but this is a different form of the same kind of totalitarianism.
Father Jerry, I need to play for you another comment by Father Spadaro, get your reaction to this. He talked about the culture war. Now, bear in mind, Father Spadaro is the man who, just a few months ago, wrote of the political collaboration between evangelicals and Catholics as being an ecumenism of hate. Here's what he said about the culture war. Watch.
Bergoglio wants to liberate pastors from the feeling of being at war, kind of a cultural war, surrounded and dismayed under a sort of Masada complex by which the church feels enclosed by a society it must fight against.
Father Jerry, how do you think pro-life people who fight for marriage and family, how do you think they feel hearing that?
Well, I think they would say that Father Spadaro doesn't really know what he's talking about. The culture war is not a right-wing invention to raise funds. You know, the culture war is the assault on Christian morality and natural law that we've been experiencing in this country and throughout the Western world, and its manifestations are clear. Contraception, abortion, euthanasia, and now we have, you know, these fantastic schemes that people want, fantastic in the bad sense, where you want to create human life in test tubes and then manipulate, all that kind of thing. In other words, it's a turning man into a commodity that's disposed of by the powerful according to what they want. Christianity is the light of truth that believes in the innate dignity of every human life, and when people violate that, we are going to fight back. To say that cultural warriorism is a wrong way of looking at it, you know, did the Christians who were being martyred in the Colosseum consider themselves to be, you know, not involved in the struggle with the Roman Empire? Of course, they knew what was going on. Now, their martyrdom was their victory, and we're the beneficiaries of it. But, you know, it's very offensive to someone to say that when Catholics and Protestants cooperate to try and promote the moral law, that this is based on hatred. It's the exact opposite. It's based on love. It's based on love for everyone, especially our most needy neighbors, the unborn and the weak.
And love of God, which I think, as you spoke about those martyrs, I'm thinking of the Chinese martyrs today who are dying imprisoned under house arrest or lose their children and family only because of their faith. It really, I don't understand. I can't even process half of this. But let me move on. We had a alleged victim of this priest in Chile who was a confrere of this Bishop Barros, who the Pope appointed despite getting warnings from the laity and some of these alleged victims saying, this man witnessed my being victimized. I spoke to a man named Juan Carlos Cruz last week and asked him about the centerpiece of this controversy is whether the Pope actually knew about this case long before he appointed this Bishop Barros as bishop of the area. This is what he told me. Watch. And it was about a letter that he shared with Cardinal O'Malley of Boston.
He reassured Marie and the others that the Pope had received the letter that he had given. He said that that the Pope had received that letter.
Now, that letter was delivered in 2015, long before he appointed Barros as bishop there. Your thoughts on this, and why does this continue to be a simmering controversy that the Pope can't put behind him?
This is very bothersome because Cardinal O'Malley is the head of the Pope's own created commission about abuse within the church. They really want to take this very seriously. That commission has been allowed to lapse. It has not been reinstated. I would think that this would be an urgent matter for the Holy See to deal with. Now, some people have tried to say that perhaps the Holy Father mislaid the letter, or he gets 100 letters a day people give to him. But this is his own self-appointed cardinal who handed this to him. And actually, there's a picture of him receiving this that some of the other members of the committee took to make sure that it was recorded, that he received it. He said he would read it. Now, what happened after that is we don't know, but certainly there is some disconnect here that's very worrisome. The Pope himself has said this is the most depressing element in the church at this moment, that is something that has to be dealt with. There needs to be an urgent follow-through. It just seems to me that it's not enough to talk about it. He's been meeting with victims every Friday, or almost every Friday.
Right,
We just learned
which came out this week,
recently,
yeah.
which is great. I mean, it's wonderful that he takes that personal approach, and that's the wonderful side of this Pope. But something has got to happen on an institutional level so that these sorts of mishaps don't take place. They discredit everything else that the Church has been rightly doing to deal with the problem.
Father Murray, your thoughts on the investigation now underway. Juan Carlos Cruz, again, that alleged victim, he met with Archbishop Scicluna, who is the Archbishop of Malta. You'll remember he was in headlines because he was part of that Maltese interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, which was, way on the other side of tradition here. He is the investigator. He's supposedly meeting with laity in Chile, but they're asked to submit full-page documents of what they intend to tell him and give that to the nuncio. How confident are you of this investigation and the results it might bear?
I'm actually confident because Archbishop Scicluna, when he was the promoter of justice in the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, was the one who investigated Maciel, Father Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ. And he personally conducted interviews with the Maciel's victims, and it was that evidence that brought Maciel down. So he has a good track record in promoting justice in this matter. The people in Chile who are going to meet with the nunciature, it's nice protocol to ask them to write down what they're going to say ahead of time, but they should be in no way feel restricted that they have to tell everything they want to the nuncio. They're giving testimony to Scicluna, not to the nuncio. Now, hopefully they're working together, but the nuncio's job is different. Scicluna is the one taking evidence in this matter. This also points out to a deeper problem, which is the question, we don't know what the Pope and his associates did as regards the allegations against Bishop Barros before the Pope appointed him to the bishopric of Osorno in Chile. Now, the Pope has said there was no evidence, that there were calumnies, that this man he found no reason to believe that this man had overlooked sexual abuse. But if this had all been done in a process where these witnesses could have been publicly notified that they were testimony would be taken, in other words, if we had employed normal legal practices in investigating a potential crime, I think people would be more satisfied. Right now, basically, you write letters to the Pope, to the nuncio, and then you hope something happens, but you never really know. This has to change. This Pope himself had said that he would establish a tribunal to investigate episcopal, meaning bishops' negligent behavior in handling these type of cases. That tribunal has never been formed, and it really should be, because right now, most people's confidence in this matter has been shattered when they find that one of the accusing parties had submitted testimony more than 2 years ago, and yet the Pope a couple of weeks ago said there was no evidence.
No evidence, yeah.
Testimony is a form of evidence.
I want to move on before we run out of time. It was announced this week by Cardinal Cupich of Chicago that he is instituting what he's calling new momentum conferences on Amoris Laetitia. These are based on a 2-day seminar he ran last year where you had people like Archbishop Scicluna showing up and others. He's doing several of these conferences at places like Notre Dame, Boston College, Santa Clara, and 47 bishops are participating. What is this about, and what is this new momentum on Amoris Laetitia? Robert Royal.
I feel like I'm back in 1968. I wrote a column in the Catholic Thing this week saying that people used to say, at least it's not 1968. I'm not so sure any longer. Because you look at some of the people who've been invited. There's one female theologian I saw who said, to say that God made all human beings, either male or female, is a very simplistic view. Now, Now, if so, this means that all the way back at that first page in Genesis, when he says, in their image and likeness, he made them male and female, he made them, that it's been wrong since the very beginning. And then I would draw the conclusion that if you're asking people like that to comment on where we are right now as a church, essentially you could say everything since the beginning has been misconstrued. So look, let's hope there are some good things that come out of this. Let's hope there are some other people. But I hear, for example, at Notre Dame, that the theology department not only is not involved in this conference, it wasn't even informed that this conference is taking place, or they don't know where it's taking place. So this is sort of something floating over our normal academic and ecclesial structures. That
so they're using the prestige of these institutions, but the members of it are not even invited.
At least as far as Notre Dame. That's the only one that I'm familiar with.
It's 47 bishops, Father Jerry Murray, and a number of theologians who are taking part in this. Cardinal Cupich has said, Amoris Laetitia is revolutionary. It is a hermeneutic shift. What does that mean, and what do you think these conferences are about?
Well, there was a conference like this at Boston College already, and at that conference, only selected journalists were allowed in. In other words, those who were favorable to what the participants were saying. So we never had the outside scrutiny from independent journalists. This would be a disaster, again, because we need to have open and free exchange of ideas, not a prepackaged set of ideas coming forward. Now, is Amoris Laetitia, is it a revolution in the Catholic Church? That has to be judged on the basis of what it says and how that can be coordinated or harmonized with all of Catholic teaching and doctrine. That's what we're currently trying to do in the Church. Some bishops' conferences, like the Maltese ones, get it wrong, in my opinion. Others have said, such as in Poland, there is no change. Adultery continues to be an obstacle to the reception of the sacraments. Let's see a discussion of how all of these things can be harmonized involving people of different points of view. For me, this looks like basically a cheerleading propaganda type session in which everybody's going to say, look, all those conservatives and traditionalists, they no longer count. John Paul II, it was true back then, it's no longer true. All these kind of ideas are out there. This is a disaster. The Catholic Church is not a political party that changes its platform every 4 years at a convention. The Catholic Church is the herald of God's truth. And so the question is here not, does so-and-so write this and say that? The question is it true according to the doctrine that Christ gave the Church? And that doctrine is well known, has been defended through the years, needs to be defended today.
I'll give you the last word, Robert Royal.
Yeah, I think that we ought to look to also, there was a lecture that Cardinal Cupich gave at Cambridge University in England in the past week. And he says there that we shouldn't pretend that we have all the answers, which is a good thought. But I don't know too many people who think they have all the answers, and most of them are not people we pay very much attention to. But we do have Christ's answers about certain things that God chose to reveal to us. And we must take those very seriously. The rest is negotiable opinions, whatever. We can be right or wrong. We can be smart or stupid about the way we do these things. But we do have some answers in the Church, and we don't only listen to every voice. We listen to a particular voice.
Very good. We'll leave it there. And to Father Antonio Spadaro, the door is open. We would love to sit and do a one-on-one interview with you sometime. You're always welcome on the world over. If you'd like to keep up with Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, their commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org. Thank you both for being here. When we return, what are the common characteristics of those who commit these horrific mass shootings? And might that knowledge help us stop their horrendous activities? We'll bring in a psychologist when the world over continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. A story from New Orleans. As you know, New Orleans is celebrating its tricentennial this year, and it wouldn't be able to celebrate its history without celebrating its Catholic roots. They were on full display at this year's Rex Parade on Mardi Gras Day. Among the Catholic-themed floats, a replica of the original St. Louis Cathedral. This one is a shout-out to the Ursuline sisters who arrived in New Orleans in 1727. The devastating Good Friday fire of 1788 is remembered here. It destroyed 80% of the city, but due to the prayers of the Ursulines, was mitigated. This float honors Venerable Henriette de Lille. She was a free woman of color who founded the Sisters of the Holy Family in 1842. And New Orleans wouldn't be New Orleans without Our Lady of Prompt Succor. Hasten to help us. And prayers are certainly needed for all those affected by this next story. In Parkland, Florida, 17 people are dead and 14 more wounded after a 19-year-old man opened fire at Stoneman Douglas High School. The suspected shooter, Nicholas Cruz, is now in police custody and he's been charged. Cruz was a former student at the school who had been expelled for disciplinary reasons. It is the deadliest school shooting in the U.S. since 26 people were killed in Connecticut at Sandy Hook Elementary back in 2012. Here with analysis is Father Charles SIKORSKY, president of the Institute for the Psychological Sciences at Divine Mercy University in Arlington, Virginia, and he's joined by psychologist and dean, Dr. SUZANNE HOLLMAN. Thank you both for being here.
You're welcome.
I want to start with some of the traits of these shooters that we've seen in these mass shootings. In your clinical work, Doctor, what are you seeing? What should people be on the lookout for? Obviously, in the case of Cruz, he was isolated, he was shunned by his peers, off to himself. What else should they be looking for? What else is common among these shooters?
I think those are very good starting points. The first thing we usually look for is any change in behavior. Is the person more withdrawn? Do they seem preoccupied with things that they may not have been as preoccupied with before? Is there a distinct change in mood? Are they spending more time alone, not coming out of their bedroom, for example, for hours at a time? So I think any significant change should immediately be flagged. And from that point on, what that change looks like becomes significant then.
Well, we hear people, we heard the sheriff the other day, and we heard it again today, the sheriff in Broward County saying, if you see something, say something. People don't know what to see. They don't know what to look for. What should they be looking for?
Well, I think in this case, if they know the person, we know that he lost his mother not too long ago, and then when you see these kinds of things, are they becoming? They look disturbed. Are they acting out on social media? That was one of the things that someone brought up.
That he wanted to be a professional school shooter.
Correct. Right. Things like that you would notice something that's just not normal. That they just seem more tense and stressed, and it's not easy. It's not easy, I don't think, for a person to recognize that. But
Dr. Holman, are there often tells in their everyday behavior? Are they more prone to violent outbursts? I've read some things where they're abusive to animals. There's family violence in some cases that they've witnessed or been subjected to. Is that a common trait?
It's, the research right now is a little all over the place. But what we do know is that all of these things are risk factors. All of these things can predispose someone to end up making a decision or planning something that dramatic. And a lot of it stems from a sense of social isolation, not being seen in the world, and then trying to find these mechanisms to ensure that they are noticed.
Is a piece of it then narcissism? Is it people wanting to leave their mark, to be recognized, to be seen as somehow acknowledged, just acknowledged by everyone?
Well, it can be, especially people who've experienced some kind of trauma growing up, want to kind of prove themselves or show themselves valuable and worthwhile. I think as well, the whole social media thing tends to isolate. We kind of create this fantasy world around us.
Right.
And then real life isn't quite so nice sometimes. And we have things we struggle with. We have disappointments. We have grief and these things. And it can just exacerbate it when there's really not a strong relational component with other people.
Right. They're not connected. They're not connected. The president talked about this today. He issued a statement. And, well, here's what he had to say. And he was speaking directly to the kids who are dealing with this trauma. Watch.
I want to speak now directly to America's children, especially those who feel lost, alone, confused, or even scared. If you need help, turn to a teacher, a family member, a local police officer, or a faith leader. Answer hate with love, answer cruelty with kindness. we must also work together to create a culture in our country that embraces the dignity of life, that creates deep and meaningful human connections, and that turns classmates and colleagues into friends and neighbors.
You talked about isolation a moment ago, and clearly a number of these shooters are isolated individuals. I worry about the screen culture. Their entire life becomes on the smartphone or video games, and particularly for boys. Talk about how influential a daily regimen of these very violent video games can be. Is that an effect or an impactor here?
You know, again, from a purely research perspective, that's something that's being looked at, because we don't have that many longitudinal studies on that. But again, the mere act of someone isolating themselves in a dark room for days at a time, watching extremely violent content, I think that I don't even think you need to be a psychologist to look at that and think and say, that doesn't sound right somehow.
Yeah, no, it's vividly violent content. I mean, the detail of some of these games, heads being blown off, and I think when you put that on a widescreen TV, and you've got, some of them have the gun actually part of the game, you plug it into your console. Adam Lanza, I'm thinking about the Sandy Hook shooter, they found a cache of games. Left 4 Dead, School Shooter. These were the games he was playing and marinating in every day. Surely that has some impact.
I think so, especially in our culture today that's so dysfunctional in so many ways, right? The breakdown of the family, of marriage, of life, all these things that the church teaches and preaches about and sometimes takes a lot of heat for. There are consequences for ignoring that, and the church isn't out to just make rules. We do it because the church teaches what it teaches, because it supports the good of the human person.
Well, you know,
and that's what we really need to be focused on. What kind of culture are we creating?
Yeah, we're hearing a lot about gun control now, and people, inevitably, they have that conversation. And look, that's a worthy conversation. You know, you have access to these weapons, I get it. On the other hand, there's almost no attention to the human person involved with pulling the trigger. And it seems to me we have to focus on what is driving young people to go into these schools, some of them schools they knew or places they know, and enact this sort of murderous violence on people. Why do we see the increase? Is it, as Father was alluding to, familial breakdown? Is that part of what we're seeing here?
You know, I think that has a lot to do with it, because it encourages this sense of disconnect that so many people feel. And the attachment theorists have a term called relational trauma. And relational trauma really speaks to that sense of disconnection, that people have these traumatic relationships or absences of relationships, and there is no one there to repair those relationships. And in the absence of that repair, that is when people feel that literally there is no one there for them, and that they will then proactively go and try to connect through violence, essentially.
Father, what should we do as classmates, teachers, clergy, parents, members of a community? Is there something we can do or be on the lookout for to stop or intervene before another one of these senseless tragedies occurs?
Well, we can follow up on some of the things that Dr. Holman mentioned. I think the bigger question, you know, John Paul II once was talking about this, the problem of evil in the midst of some crisis, and he mentioned that certainly as Christians, you know, we deplore evil actions. He said, but that's not enough. We're called to do a lot more. And he quoted St. Paul, we're called to conquer evil by doing good. And the ultimate answer is spreading the Christian faith. And it's working together to evangelize our culture, to create, to evangelize, but also to create respect for the family, and really draw attention to the fundamental values that build our culture up. Unfortunately, that's a long process, but you know, evangelization is a team sport, and we all have a role, not just clergy.
Well, and beyond evangelization, or perhaps the first movement of that evangelization, has to be love and human concern. And look, I've watched very closely interviews with these kids, some of them very articulate. The kids that went running out of that school in terror the other day as the gunfire broke out. But they also admitted they didn't know him. They had no interaction with him. They considered him kind of a freak and an outcast. He sat in a gazebo that they designated for kind of the freakish kids. There was a role that I think we all play in these things, known or unknown, seen or unseen, to coin a phrase. How do we arrest ourselves and sensitize ourselves to these people who are crying out, perhaps silently, in their isolation?
I think that the first step really is to look deep inside ourselves and ask ourselves, when we do notice something, what is it that's stopping us from reaching out? Is it because it feels too difficult, or we're not sure what to do? Is it too threatening? We really have to push ourselves to reach out to those people who are in that gazebo, as you say.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a conversation.
That's
right. What they lack.
And another part of that, we talked before about the social media and the phones. You know, maybe parents can start controlling that a little bit more, so that when your kids are with their friends in school, they're not just checking their phone and so forth, but actually paying attention to the person next to them.
You know, I'm amazed in so many communities across America. Here, we lived in Virginia for many years, and we recently moved back to New Orleans. The difference in the way the children interact with one another is startling to me as a parent. When we were here, most kids dated, courted, had their relationships sitting across from each other, texting with a phone. You almost never see that in New Orleans. Now, that doesn't mean they don't text, but when they get together, they're really talking, they're interacting. Sometimes they're fighting and arguing, but they're at least connecting as people. It seems to me we have to insist upon that for kids.
Yes.
And have we done enough as educators, as parents, in that area?
I don't think we have, and I am increasingly seeing cases where the parents and the children are texting one another to solve conflict.
Not talking, even though they're in the same house.
Even though they're in the same house, that you will have a teenager and a parent have an argument over text messaging. So I guess we need to start at home.
Yeah, it's an avoidance. It's an avoidance mechanism.
That family dinner every night, or as many nights as you can do it, to really foster good conversations and good relationships in the family. And then I think the more we do that, those closest to us, it carries over. It carries over.
Well, those bonds, when you're close to the people near you, if there's a problem in the family, you can work to solve it. Right. But if you're utterly disconnected, everybody's in their own little satellite, you don't know what's going on. You're so detached, you don't know what that other person's doing, and now they're living in their own little private hell in some cases, and they're completely disconnected from their peers and family, and it's a terrible, you get a real hell from the artificially created one. And I do think it's up to all of us to step in and be that good Samaritan for those who need it in those dark moments.
Absolutely.
I thank you both for shining some light on this and for all you do.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Find out more about the Institute for the Psychological Sciences by visiting divinemercy.edu. When we return, she's an ABC News correspondent who's just written her first book for children. LINSEY DAVIS tells us what inspired her and what she thinks we might be missing in children's literature. The World Over continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Now to our story-ended segment. My next guest is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and she's now added to her resume, she is a children's book author. Her new book, The World is Awake, a celebration of everyday blessings, is at bookstores everywhere. I'm joined by ABC News correspondent LINSEY DAVIS. LINSEY, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Raymond. I so appreciate it.
Look, I want to jump in. This is your first book for kids. Now, you credit your son, Aidan, with having inspired you to write this book. How did that come about?
We were in the car, and he may have just been about 2 years old, and out of nowhere, he just said, "Mommy, does God open up the flowers?" And I loved the idea that he was curious about God and also wanting to make this connection between God and nature. And so I figured, you know what? Other kids then probably have that same curiosity, and let's make that connection for them through nature, just kind of a meaningful and gentle introduction to God for toddlers.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. Now, here's my question, and I know this position deeply. As somebody on television, given your schedule, raising a family, how did you find time to write and to dedicate time to this book?
So writing the book actually was relatively quick. I mean, maybe just 2 weeks worth of after I'd rush home after World News, then read some stories to my son, tuck him into bed, and then if I didn't have a Good Morning America to work on for the next morning, I would spend some time writing. And it was exciting for me. It was a nice outlet because, you know, I mean, it's the same hat in its most basic self in that I'm a writer every day. I tell stories every day. But this was something that was uplifting and joyful and not the destruction and death that so often I'm talking about each day.
Yeah, no, it does become an escape. I write children's books too, and it's nice to kind of get into that other space and shake off the day and the horror we have to report. You use Psalm 118:24 as a foundation for this book. And that psalm reads, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." Why that psalm?
Let us rejoice and be glad in it.
How did you first encounter that?
Well, you know, it's something that I grew up in the church, always was going to Sunday school from as young as I can remember. And it was something that really kind of stuck with me. And then, interestingly, once I had my son, early in the morning when I'd, you know, be waking up with him, it was something I would say to him. This is a day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I don't know what made that psalm kind of come to mind, that particular scripture, but that's what it was. So when I was writing the book, it just seemed like the natural start.
What role did your own faith play in developing this book? And was there any hesitation? I mean, there is a, you know, particularly when you're in this line of work, revealing that intimate part of yourself is sometimes a scary thing.
Right. I mean, it's something that we don't talk about as journalists. I mean, we try and stay very partial, right? And so it's not something that really comes up with our reporting. But it was important to me, and it is important to me as a faith-based person and someone who has a very strong belief and always has, you know, from a very young age. And the main thing for me is that I want to instill that in my son. And so, you know, while we have a lot of Bible baby books at home, and my son enjoys, you know, Daniel in the Lion's Den and Jonah and the Whale and David and Goliath, but he's too young to be able to understand God's hand in that. And so I just wanted to be able to reach his age group to give a sense of where God is and God's handiwork and how his creations all around us that just abound, and in a way that I think that often as adults we kind of forget about the marvels of the Lord that are right around us, right? And so we kind of put our blinders on and we go through our daily routine without noticing the butterflies and the bunny rabbits and the rainbows. And I think that that's something that often through a child's eyes and a child's presence in our lives, they remind us about that wide-eyed joy that we can experience through God's creations every day.
You know, I've always thought children's literature particularly gives us, it has a sense of awe and wonder in it, and it does focus us. When you read E.B. White, when you read Charlotte's Web, it reacquaints us with those everyday miracles around us and changes the way we see the world around us. And I love that in The World Awake, your book, you talk about the flowers being glad, and the stones would sing out if they could, and the animals, and it sort of brings it all into God's embrace. But as you said, it's very gentle, and it's through the eyes of a child. Here's what I want to know. What is Aidan's favorite part of the book as you read it to him?
Well, and it's interesting because he likes just that part that you were talking about, and that even the rocks would cry out if they could. And that is also a subtle scripture reference, right? From Luke, when Jesus is talking to the disciples, I think it is, and he says, you know, if the people didn't praise, then the rocks would cry out. And so we kind of have just those references to the Bible, and unbeknownst. So I think that kids later on, as they're really reading the Bible, they might say, oh yeah, that's right. But Aidan, at this point, he's saying it's his favorite book. I don't know if he's just placating me or not, but he says, oh, Mama, you know, this is your book. He's excited. He's excited about it.
Well, you're in a long, good tradition, a solid tradition of authors who wrote for their children initially and then welcomed a lot of other kids to the fan base. Tell me, what I love about the book, too, there are a pair of African-American children and the entire family featured in the book. Why was that diversity important to you, and having these characters rendered this way? It doesn't change anything in the descriptions in the book, but those pictures do send an important message.
You know, and it's interesting because I was getting interviewed about this, and somebody asked me, well, how did you write the book differently? And I said, you know what? As a matter of fact, I didn't write the book differently. The only reason why the children are a different color is because the illustrator painted them that way. I mean, this is just about children. And in those scenes where they're at the zoo and they're at the market, you see all different kinds of colors of children and ethnicities and backgrounds. And I want every child that reads this book to be able to point to someone that says, oh, that looks like me, or that looks like my mommy or daddy or grandmother. And the reason is there is an essay that put it so well. It's by a Professor Bishop, I believe it is, out of Ohio State. And she wrote an essay, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And the idea was that every children's book, it's essential that they have a mirror so that the child can see themselves reflected in the book, a window so that they can peer out and see this unfamiliar world to them, perhaps. And when that window is able to be effective, it's able to become a sliding glass door to transport them into this different world. Children look to books for self-affirmation. They look to books to find themselves, and if they don't find themselves, they may start looking elsewhere. And so it's important, you know, for not just black and brown children to be able to see themselves, but for white children to see diversity. Because if you live in an area that may not be so diverse, you want that inclusion. You want that sense of, oh yeah, those kids look different, but we're so much the same, and we enjoy doing the same things.
Right, and they also look to books, and I think the characters in books, to make sense of the world that they're just about to enter. I guess that's the sliding door you were referencing a moment ago. What do you want parents and those children who read this book to come away with? What of that next step in their lives do you want them to absorb from reading this picture book?
Well, I want parents to remember what it felt like to have that joy. You know, I would put it this way, in that my son loves to skip at his age. And I feel like at some point as adults, we stop skipping, and I'm not sure why. But my son will say, Mommy, come on and skip with me. And then I skip with him, and I remember this is so fun, and it feels so good, and it's so joyful, and just a happy memory from my childhood. And I think that as adults, we need to embrace that and get back to that. Just the basic things that just make your soul smile, that, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with money or anything materialistic. It's just things that are free and that there for us to enjoy, you know, just looking at the rainbow and paying attention to a bee and the flowers. I mean, it's just kind of the old adage of taking time to smell the roses. And I wanted to just reinforce that with children, and looking at when they see these things to realize, look, this is God's creation. You are God's creation. You know, there's a part in the book where we say, and you, beautiful, beautiful you. And that's really what I just wanted children to see. Look, you are marvelously and wonderfully made by God.
Well, Lindsay, I couldn't have put it better myself. And this week that has been so clouded by tragedy, the shooting in Florida, I received your book and I read it to my little girl, and then started covering this horrific shooting. And it does remind us of the beauty of God in every one of us. So we're all children of God. And maybe if people had spent a little more time with this shooter and given him a little more attention, we might have averted this disaster. And I think your book, The World Awake, reminds us to not only concern ourselves and be awakened anew to the creation around us, but to each other. So I thank you for that, and I wish you the best with the book.
Amen. Yes.
The World Awake by Lindsey Davis is available at bookstores everywhere and online. Lindsay, thank you for being here. That is all the time we have. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com, and be sure to join us next week. Set your DVRs so you don't miss a moment. You can follow me, of course, online where the show never ends. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.